look us over, women proud and strong. Time to hear our voices, time to hear our song. Silent for too long, powerless as well. But now the earth is crying out, and people will respond by saying, let's work together, build, not destroy. Teach our children kindness to every girl and boy, 'cause the planet is home to all of us, and that's the song we sing. Hear the raging grannies sing.
90 years after the end of the First World War, we're still dealing with its legacy. It's probable that on its 100th anniversary, 10 years from now, the mess will still not have been cleaned up. We could spend a week, we could spend a month, we could spend a university term or two going through the various outcomes that shaped our world that are linked to the First World War. However, I think that they boil down to two big ones, really, that came about as a result of the decision by the Western European and North American ruling classes to resolve their economic competition by trying to crush each other militarily. The first was the redivision of the colonial world, as it was then called, and economically backward sections of Europe, the source of much wealth to these ruling classes. The criminal ineptitude of their efforts has left millions of dead, tens of millions dead in their wake, and laid the basis for seemingly unending conflicts. And the second was the mass revolutionary upsurge after the slaughter by millions of people who tried to ensure that the plotters of this mass murder of 1914 to 1918 could and would never happen again, by overthrowing the social and economic system that had caused the war. That revulsion and the movement it spawned was cruelly defeated, and future generations paid the price in World War II and subsequent wars, along with environmental degradation, and a host of other evils that we are facing in the world today. So the price of that defeat has been long-lasting and bitter, and we are its inheritors, unfortunately, whether we like it or not. As a friend of mine said in a song, the meek shall inherit the earth because they haven't the strength to refuse. The division of spoils began before the war and during the war. The divvying up of the proceeds, as it were. Germany was defeated, and its colonial possessions, which were numerous and not necessarily well known, were laid on the table for carving like a Thanksgiving turkey. And speaking of Turkey, that's where I want to begin. The Ottoman Empire, which had been known as the sick man of Europe, had collapsed. In 1915, long before that collapse, secret treaties were signed where they divided up what they anticipated would be the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. The French, the British, the Italians, and the Russians were all supposed to get the juicy bits. The Russians, unfortunately, because of the revolution, were not able to take advantage of their participation, and the Italians, oddly enough, had no appetite after the end of the war for being involved in this. The French and the British, however, were not so shy and not so reluctant, and they sat down to dine, just the two of them. They started with a treaty, two gentlemen, Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot. And it sounds like a kind of vaudeville routine, Mr. Sykes, Mr. Picot, etc. They came to terms over an agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where France got Lebanon and Syria. The British got the three provinces that became Iraq and Transjordania, which included what is now Jordan and Palestine. The only problem with this was that the British, true to form, had made a number of side deals. somebody once called it perfidious Albion, and seemed like a good name. They had promised the Arab nationalists independent states if they supported the anti-Turkish cause. Fair enough. At the same time, they wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, the English banker and major Zionist, promising the Jews a state of some sort, a homeland, as they described it, in Palestine, assuming, of course, that they would treat with tender mercy the inhabitants who were already living in Palestine. But they forgot to tell the Arab nationalists this, and they also forgot to tell the Zionists that they had made these promises. So as a result, we have the situation that we have now that goes back to there. The Syrians begged to differ, and they declared independence, but they were soon defeated by the French. The Iraqis struggled against the British and met the same fate, at least for a while. The Kurds had been promised an independent state, and they were promptly sold down the river, the Euphrates, I assume, and ended up divided between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Persia, which was a kind of neo-British entity at that point, and was soon to be Iran. The Kurds remain, in fact, the largest ethnic group in the world that does not have a state. And what is going on today in Turkey, what is going on today in Iraq, what is going on today in Syria, what is going on today in Iran goes back to that betrayed promise to the Kurds. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks were forced to leave Western Anatolia, where they had lived for centuries, after Greece had been encouraged by the French to attack Turkey, which was weak after its defeat. However, the Turks rallied and chased out hundreds, as I say, hundreds of thousands of people who washed up on the shores where their poverty and exile led to, amongst other things, the creation of Rembetiko, a Greek blues, and a still simmering hatred between Greeks and Turks, best expressed by the ongoing separation of northern and southern Cyprus. And these are people who had lived together in peace for centuries. The Armenians, who had been massacred by the Turkish army during the war and who had been promised a great deal, again, were betrayed and left with a good half of historic Armenia in the hands of Turkey. Oddly enough, it was the Russian government of the Bolsheviks that gave solace and support to the Armenians in the creation of an independent Armenia. However, still, the situation of Armenia and the Armenians is a hot topic and one of the things that consistently gets in the way around negotiations of Turkey entering the European Union. The Turks, however, at the end were the winners. By refusing to be bound to the treaties, by refusing to allow their country to be carved up at the Treaty of Sèvres, or a number of these deals were done a little later, the nationalist regime of Ataturk fought for and gained control of the Turkish Anatolian heartland, leaving outside, unfortunately, or inside, to their displeasure, the Armenians and Kurds, who had placed their trust and their faith in the hands of their British and French protectors, and particularly in the promises of American President Wilson, who, in addition to coining the term the war to end all wars, also celebrated self-determination for small peoples, oppressed peoples, at least when he was trying to mobilize the American public to support the war. But after the war, it was no longer Wilson, and it was no longer what was done. So when we look today at the situation in Iraq, we can trace it back directly to the outcome of the First World War. When we look at the situation in Palestine, Israel, we can trace that directly back to the First World War. When we look at the struggle of the Kurds, whether it be in Turkey, whether it be in northern Iraq, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Iran, we can trace that back directly to the First World War. This is what these gangsters and robbers, having murdered millions and millions of people during the war left for future generations. This is the inheritance we have of the people whose portraits, generally not in this building, thank God, but sit in our House of Parliament, in the American Congress, and the French, etc., etc. Great diplomats all. The fate of the German colonial empire was another story, but with different partners. Once again, the British and the French were involved, but here the Japanese entered the carve-up, the Belgians, and even Portugal was a diner. The Portuguese were a bit player. I had no idea why the Portuguese got involved in the First World War. It didn't really seem like a reasonable thing to do, but they did. And after the war, when German East Africa was carved up, the province of Kiona was added to the Portuguese colony in Mozambique. This is something you might find useful at some kind of obscure contest, etc. The French, again, were relatively marginal, given that they were enormously dominant in Africa, but they managed to pick up half of the Cameroons and half of Togo, with the British getting the other half. The British got Southwest Africa, which became under South African domination, which was part of the British Empire at that point, which is now Namibia. And Tanganyika was divided up into 3 provinces, one of which became Tanganyika and since Tanzania, and the other 2, which I'll get back to, became Burundi and Rwanda, and they were given to the Belgians. In the Pacific, the British and their associates in Australia and New Zealand got German New Guinea, Nauru, Western Samoa, which is now an American possession. The Japanese did well. They got the Marshall, Caroline, and a bunch of other islands, which were handed over to the Americans after World War II. Thus, perhaps one of the most obscure groups of people who remained the victims of the First World War became the islanders of Rongelap, who first were forced to live under the Germans, which they didn't mind so much. German colonialism was relatively placid in that part of the Pacific. But then they were shipped off to the Japanese, and finally the Americans, who had administered the unkindest cut of all. The islands were occupied in 1944. They were added to the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. And between 1946 and 1958, the United States tested 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, including the largest test that the Americans ever conducted, Castle Bravo. You always wonder who names these things. The claims for compensation between the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands and the United States is still going on, and the health effects still linger from the nuclear tests. Rongelap Atoll is an island located in Micronesia. It had 61 little islands. It's not very big, a combined area of 3 square miles. It's very, very small. However, in 1954, after Castle Bravo went off, the winds shifted in a way that the scientists had not predicted. Don't you hate that when the scientists predict something? It's a little bit like dealing with global warming in its own way, and this was a kind of forerunner. So Castle Bravo was the first hydrogen bomb, and it dropped inches of contaminated ash on the residents of Rongelap. They were promptly relocated to Kwajalein for medical treatment, though for many of them it was too late. Finally, they were allowed to return in 1957 until they had to be evacuated again, this time by Greenpeace in 1985. They settled on another island in the Kwajalein Atoll. And finally, in September of 1996, you'll be glad to know that the United States Department of the Interior gave them $45 million to cover the death and other unfortunate effects of Castle Bravo. So, again, looking back at the First World War, we can see that the most unlikely groups of people, the islanders of Rongelap, for whom the First World War must have been a mystery, came to dominate their lives and has a profound and unending effect on their lives. And this is one of hundreds, thousands of tragedies that took place because of this economic competition between the great powers. Perhaps the outcome of the First World War that we are most familiar with, although I would certainly say Palestine is right up there, is Rwanda. This was certainly the cruelest fate, ultimately, for the former subjects of German colonialism at the hands of their liberators. As I said, before World War I, Rwanda was part of German East Africa. And it's ironic that at the carve-up that took place, the so-called peace talks, the Belgians, who had been perceived and kind of branded, we would say today, in Allied propaganda as the innocent victims of German militarism, plucky little Belgium, would be the creators of the preconditions for one of the fiercest genocidal slaughters of the 20th century. The Germans kind of picked up Rwanda in the 1880s. They only had a few thousand soldiers there, and they essentially relied on the alliances with a variety of allies there. And there was a rebellion there known as the Maji War. However, by 1911, the Germans had solidified their relationship with one particular ethnic group known as the Tutsi. And they helped them put down a rebellion of Hutus in the northern part of Rwanda who did not want to submit to central Tutsi control. In 1916, Belgian forces advanced from the Belgian Congo, which had been the personal property of the King of Belgium. The Belgian forces advanced, and Belgium, after the war, accepted magnanimously the League of Nations mandate to govern Rwanda Urundi, as it was called, along with the Congo. And Great Britain magnanimously accepted Tanganyika and the other German colonies. The Belgians solidified the relationship that the Germans had established with the Tutsis, and the Tutsi upper class and the lower class, which essentially were Hutus, lived on, not liking each other. In 1926, the Belgians abandoned a whole series of local posts around land, and in so doing, they stripped the Hutus of their very, very limited, but still fundamentally important in an agricultural country, control over the land there. So, at this point, this ethnic division also became transformed into a class division between those who ruled, those who controlled means of production, resources, and those who did not. And ultimately, we know the result, that after Rwanda became independent, the Hutus and the Tutsis did not get along, to say the least, and ultimately the mass of hundreds of thousands of Tutsis and Hutus who were opposed to this ethnographic division, etc., broke out in the 90s. And again, we are still living with those results. And of course, we're living with that every time you turn on the news and see what is happening in the eastern Congo, which was formerly the Belgian Congo, and borders Rwanda, and I won't even go into Burundi. But again, millions of people have died in the last decade or so, the civil war, so-called, in the Congo and in Rwanda. And we can trace this back to the tender colonial mercies and administration of Germany and then Belgium, supported by its allies. Again, another legacy that we have inherited from the First World War. I'll stop there. It can be too depressing to think of Palestine, the Kurds, the Armenians, Iraq, the Pacific Islanders, and the Rwandans. And look at perhaps one of the things that we can celebrate in a certain kind of sense after the First World War.